Well, I'd better warn you, this video will probably be the most unhinged analysis video on the channel. In fact, Chainsaw Man has several levels of reading, but when you really push the analysis of a work, you don't really know if the interpretations you're making were intended by the author, if he brought them about unconsciously, or if you're simply overinterpreting. For this analysis, I personally think that what I'm about to say was brought about more or less consciously by Fujimoto, but there's a chance that I'll sometimes fall into overinterpretation, so, well, you can tell me in the comments if it seems credible or not, but in any case I feel I've put my finger on something interesting, and I'll of course explain everything that makes me find it credible. As usual, I'll be spoiling all of part 1, and I'll also be talking a little about Fujimoto's other mangas, without spoiling too much, because they're essential for me to understand Fujimoto, and therefore to understand Chainsaw Man. The Chainsaw Devil, the Chainsaw Man, is a singular and particularly feared devil because of a unique faculty he possesses, which is revealed to us in chapter 84 by Makima. When the Chainsaw Man eats a devil, its existence disappears completely, and by its existence we mean not only the devil itself, but also the fear it embodies. So eating the Death Devil, the Hunger Devil, or the Cover Letter Devil would wipe these things completely out of existence, making us forget they ever existed, as if they'd never been there in the first place. And since a devil's power depends on how much he is feared, this ability alone is enough to make the Chainsaw Man a super powerful devil. Not because he is feared by humans, but because it is the devils themselves who are afraid of him, since the Chainsaw Man is the only entity in the world capable of making them disappear. In fact, the Chainsaw Man is the equivalent of the Death Devil for the devils themselves. But why did Fujimoto include such an anomaly in the universe he built? Because Chainsaw Man's power really does seem to come out of nowhere. Like, why would something like this already exist? And why does it fall on the Chainsaw Devil? It just doesn't make sense. Kishibe will have the same reaction. At the very least, you could say that this power is part of the very foundation of his lore, that it's one of his axioms, and that there's no point in looking for an explanation. But for me, making the Chainsaw Man in particular a devil capable of making other devils disappear, of making men's fears disappear, clearly has a hidden meaning. But first, I'm going to have to digress quite a bit to make sure you understand my train of thought. Those who have read Fujimoto's other mangas should have understood by now, but he's a huge fan of cinema. In fact, he talks about it in almost all his manga. In Fire Punch, cinema is of paramount importance throughout the story, and more recently we've had Goodbye Eri, which you'll be able to find Sosa's big analysis of on the channel when he's finished it, where the whole one-shot is really about cinema and how to make a film. Even in Look Back, his other one-shot devoted to manga, we'll see the protagonist take a little trip to the cinema. As for Chainsaw Man, we'll talk about it in more detail later, but we'll have the whole passage where Denji and Makima go to the cinema together, which is probably the only moment in the whole manga where Makima is sincere with Denji. And she says a rather mysterious sentence. Out of a dozen films, there's often only one that fascinates me, but one of those was enough to change my life. And now we're going to do a bit of theorizing, even if it's not necessarily essential for what follows. Personally, I think the film that changed his life was The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Chainsaw Massacre is a horror film released in 1974 and is one of the most important films in the history of horror and cinema. Anyway, it's simple. I'm willing to bet you've all heard of it, even though most of you probably haven't seen it. In short, it's a true pillar of the genre. And why do I think that? Well, remember what I said in the review video about Makima. She loves the Chainsaw Man for the fear he inspires, because she thinks he's the only being capable of having an equal relationship with her. That's why I think Chainsaw Massacre changed her life, because it must have been the first film to scare her. And I'd go even further and say that the Chainsaw Man was born of this film, and that his love for it comes as much from the fear it inspires as from the fear this film inspired in her. And if that sounds like a bit of a far-fetched theory, I'd like to remind you of a nuance that some people may not have seen, but which is obvious when you think about it. The Chainsaw Man isn't actually the Chainsaw Devil, it's the Chainsaw Man's devil. And yes, it was all in the title from the start. But even if we set aside this completely hypothetical explanation of the Chainsaw Man's creation, because it's not all that important in the end, I think we've put our finger on what Fujimoto wanted to convey to us by making the Chainsaw Man the devil devouring other devils, devouring our fears in fact. For me, the Chainsaw Man, and especially his power, is a metaphor for cinema, and even more broadly for pop culture. As I've already said, for Fujimoto, cinema and pop culture play an extremely important role in the lives of all his characters, and even in his own life. So it's no surprise that in Fire Punch, he creates a character who wants to do everything in his power to recreate an advanced human civilization with the sole aim of producing a new Star Wars. And I'm telling you all this so that you understand that my interpretation, however exaggerated it may seem, is ultimately quite credible when you know a little about Tatsuki Fujimoto. In short, if the Chainsaw Man and his power are a metaphor for cinema and pop culture, it's because, in my opinion, Fujimoto wanted to tell us that cinema and pop culture are so powerful that they can make us forget all our everyday problems. Fiction allows us to escape, to make our fears disappear, to devour them, even if it means creating new fears that are totally artificial and entertaining, as in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And once you've realized that, you can start to find a different way of reading a lot of fights. Take the Darkness Devil, for example. We know that he wants the Chainsaw Man's heart at all costs, to eliminate him no doubt. And if we push the analysis further, we can see in it a metaphor for the fight between pop culture and obscurantism. And when I talk about obscurantism, I'm talking about the tendency of certain groups to want to censor everything, whether for religious, moral, or other reasons. And this is all the more relevant given that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was censored when it was released. It was banned in several countries. Some cinemas stopped showing it because of complaints about its excessive violence, etc. It also makes sense that the Chainsaw Man completely kicks out the Hell Devil, as if pop culture were taking precedence over religion in influencing everyday life. As if even the religious fear of hell had become anecdotal, pop culture having taken on even greater importance. And once again, I know this may sound crazy, and that many of you will disagree with what Fujimoto is saying if it's what he's saying, but knowing the guy, I find it very likely. Besides, this isn't the first time he's made these comparisons between pop culture and religion, and anyone who's read Fire Punch knows it. Because in Fire Punch we see a whole kind of state based on a religion based on the hero of a shitty movie who is made to look like a god, because people don't even know what cinema is anymore. And there's a lot more to be said about the links between pop culture and religion in Fire Punch, but if I start getting into that, we'll be here for a while, and I'll avoid spoiling Fire Punch too much. It's a video about Chainsaw Man after all. Still, I sincerely believe that according to Fujimoto, pop culture can very well replace religion, or even that the two are similar, and that my interpretation of the fight, if you can call it that, between Chainsaw Man and the Hell Devil doesn't seem all that absurd to me. But for me, the most interesting metaphors come from the fight against Makima at the end of the manga, because that's where I think the real meaning of Chainsaw Man comes from. Because that's where we'll see his two real enemies, the two enemies of pop culture, elitism and capitalism. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds like it's coming out of nowhere, but you'll see that it makes sense. In the first fight against Makima, Denji, or rather the Chainsaw Man, loses because humans start to adore him, to iconize him, to turn him into a superhero in fact, to make him the exact opposite of what he was in the beginning, since I remind you, or at least this is my hypothesis, that he was born from the villain of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Makima sums it all up perfectly with a sentence that I think is crucial to understanding Fujimoto's point. The whole world has adopted Chainsaw Man. He's become a character we promote, whose image we consume. There's nothing to fear from him anymore. In fact, by having Makima say this, Fujimoto is speaking to us about the tendency of cinema and pop culture to seek profit above all else, which flows quite naturally from capitalism. What he's criticizing here is the tendency to make sequels after sequels after sequels, to exploit every successful license to the point of completely distorting it. This was also true of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which spawned 8 other films of questionable quality. In fact, he criticizes the industrialization of art, the fact that people are only interested in making money at the expense of creativity, while at the same time criticizing people's fanboyism and their tendency to consume everything they can get their hands on, as long as it has something to do with what they like, and to buy lots of goodies and so on. We see this once again with Makima, who refers to humans as dogs, saying that they're easy to manipulate and both intelligent and stupid. And it's not for nothing that on the page where the Chainsaw Man loses to her and she gets angry, we see just below fans cosplaying as Chainsaw Man. They're consuming his image, as she puts it. The Chainsaw Man has become mainstream and is being reclaimed by the masses. He's no longer scary, he's just become a marketing tool. It's been hijacked by the industry, emptied of its substance, a bit like everything else that works well in cinema, or even elsewhere. In short, it becomes weak and loses out to Makima, and so pop culture becomes weak. Just as the Chainsaw Man can no longer devour devils, pop culture can no longer rid us of our everyday worries. The profit motive above all weakens pop culture, devours it, and that's why I say that capitalism is an enemy of pop culture, even if pop culture was born from it. Or at least the fact of thinking of cinema and pop culture only as an industry, and not as an art form. The second enemy, elitism, is symbolized by Makima. Makima loves cinema, or rather, she loves great films, and only great films. She's what you might call an elitist cinephile, In fact, there's a line of dialogue that may seem innocuous at first glance but is nonetheless quite revealing of her elitist side, and that's when Denji asks her if, in the perfect world Makima wants to create, there will be a place for rotten films. To which Makima replies that it would be nice if these films disappeared. In fact, Makima is in a way a representation of the elite, of the dominant class that wants to maintain its domination over others at all costs, and to this end will create a kind of hierarchy of art. For them, pop culture, films that are a bit mainstream, a bit naff, etc., are not real art, not real culture. They're something that's served up to the masses, and whose existence is of no interest whatsoever, that should be suppressed. It has nothing to do with truly great films, with true art, with true culture, which is far superior and which the masses are too stupid to understand. That's why it's an enemy of pop culture, because it wants to see it disappear in exchange for real culture by its own standards. That's why she hates Denji so much, because she sees him as someone who stole her real film, her real Chainsaw Man, who distorted it for the benefit of the masses, basically. All this despite the fact that she's at the origin of this transformation, since she's the one who made the Chainsaw Man popular in order to weaken him. But if I push the analysis a little too far, you could even say that it's logical, since the elite have every interest in using capitalism to maintain their domination, but in doing so, even they can lose something. Anyway, the point is that Denji is going to oppose her and give us a kind of solution to all this, and thus deliver what I think is the main message of Chainsaw Man. Just before the final battle begins, there's that dialogue I mentioned earlier where Denji asks Makima if she'll make the rotten films disappear, and she replies that she will. Denji then replies, "Okay, so I'll have to kill you." For me, this dialogue is super important because not only does it show Denji emancipating himself and following his own ideas, but above all, it shows the difference between him and Makima. Makima is the elitist cinephile I mentioned earlier, while Denji is a cool cinephile. Like Makima, Denji understands great films, and has the same artistic sensibility that enables him to appreciate high-level works. You can see it in the cinema, where he reacts in the same way as she does to the film, which is, incidentally, a Soviet film from 1959 called Ballad of a Soldier, available on YouTube with English subtitles. I'll give you the link in the description. But unlike Makima, even if he's aware that a film is a bit rubbish, he knows how to appreciate it for what it is. He knows how to recognize what's good in these films, rather than looking down on them. And for me, that's very representative of Fujimoto's personality, who himself says he draws as much inspiration from the worst dreck as he does from the greatest films. In fact, when you think about it, Chainsaw Man is literally a huge homage to those rotten films, to Z-series, to Nanas, to films that get 3/10 on Letterboxd. Whether through the violence and gore exaggerated to the point of absurdity, the vulgarity, the trashiness, or all those moments of absurd humor. And I'm not even talking about the fact that he built a whole narrative over several chapters just to logically bring in a fight between Denji, Beam, and the Typhoon Devil, all to make a fucking reference to Sharknado, one of the worst films in history. And even beyond that, once again he talks about these crappy movies in his other manga. Go and read Fire Punch, and especially Goodbye Eri. You'll see it's quite explicit. In short, through Denji, Fujimoto shows us what he thinks is the best way to consume pop culture. By making him fight against Makima, the elitist cinephile who wishes to make pop culture disappear in favor of a real culture that would be purer, one might say. And by making him win, even though he has been weakened by his other enemy, capitalism, or the fact of seeing art as a means of making money above all else, he shows us how to fight these two enemies at the same time. In fact, he shows us that you don't have to be a pedantic elitist or a random influencer who's taken in by the industry. You just have to know how to appreciate things at their true value, small films as well as big ones. And it's by doing this that we'll be able to take pop culture to the next level. In the end, if Makima loses, it's because, obsessed by the real Chainsaw Man, by what she thinks is the real cinema, she forgets about Denji, whom she had never really watched, just as she never really watched the rotten films. As for Denji, if he wins, it's because he leaves the real Chainsaw Man for a moment, because he abandons the greatness he's made out to be, because he accepts the fact that he's just a cheesy movie. Then he becomes a new Chainsaw Man by taking over the heart of Pochita, a Chainsaw Man who mixes his grandiose cult side with his slightly lame and rotten side. A Chainsaw Man whose evolution we'll be able to follow in part 2 and see how he turns out. And for me, that's what Chainsaw Man is all about. A work that's at once very cheesy, almost ridiculous at times, that doesn't take itself too seriously and all that, but which at certain moments knows how to become grandiose and truly memorable. Drawing inspiration from the greatest masterpieces as well as the smallest works, Fujimoto has created a work that, by playing with these contrasts, is as absurd as it is magnificent. It's proof that art, whether grandiose or mediocre, will always deserve to exist, that there will always be something good to come from it. And that for me is the true meaning of Chainsaw Man. Well, I hope I haven't lost you too much or gone too far. I admit that this analysis may sound a bit far-fetched. I may have pushed things a bit too far at times, but after reading Fujimoto's interviews or his other mangas, I can't help thinking about it all. This is just my personal analysis, but I'm convinced that there's some truth in what I've told you. I also feel that there are certain points where I could have pushed the analysis even further, but to be honest, sometimes it's a bit beyond my skill set, plus I don't know that much about cinema, so considering that he talks a lot about cinema, that doesn't help. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it and maybe it's put you on the trail of some interesting interpretations. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this in the comments. Also, I've said pretty much everything I had to say about Chainsaw Man Part 1, I think. The truth is I could make more videos, but I've said the essentials and I want to talk about lots of other things too. So I don't think I'll be doing any more videos on Chainsaw Man before Part 2 comes out. You can like, share, subscribe, etc. as usual. And see you next time.